Schriefer. Now I feel compelled to explain why I'm with the U.S. government now. Be careful of what you say. I used to always say everybody should serve at some point in their life. And of course, I had comfortably been working for close to 20 years in the NGO sector when my predecessor informed me that she was going back to the NGO sector, and it was my time to come and serve, and I should give it a try from the other side. So I've been doing that for about a year and a half now. Bureau for National Organizations is probably not the powerhouse of the State Department, but I think it has become increasingly influential, as has our sister bureau, the Bureau for Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor. And I think that reflects a really important shift in culture in terms of how the United States looks at foreign policy and foreign relations, because those two things, ideally work seamlessly together, but sometimes they're in contradiction. I recently read a book called In the Garden of Beasts that documents the time of the American ambassador who was in Germany in the 1930s during the rise of Hitler. And what was so fascinating about this book to me, also about what was going on in Germany at the time, was the culture of the State Department and how alien that is to me now. The primary concern of the United States during the rise of Hitler and these passage of these horrific laws and these attacks on individual citizens was not human rights. It was how to get Germany to repay its debt. And there was huge frustration for this American ambassador for continuing to raise all these troublesome issues that really weren't as high a priority. That has totally shifted. And of course, it comes in ebbs and flows. But it is, I think, a permanent shift in that culture. This gives me an opportunity to put my old Freedom House hat back on for just a little bit to talk about the global state of human rights. And Jakob and some of the others mentioned some of the Freedom House rankings. If you look back, if looking at the global state of human rights, it's really hard to not be pessimistic if you look at the short term. And I believe you mentioned that as well. If you go back, 5 or 10 years, Freedom House now documents these 8 years of essential stagnation, larger declines in freedoms than gains. Certainly that is sobering, and the past year has been very sobering, whether it's from violence and human rights abuses that have come from conflict. Syria, of course, is the most egregious example in terms of scale, but certainly not the only one. As I've already mentioned, we had the Central African Republic. We had where violence broke down along religious lines. You have South Sudan, where political disputes have now broken down along ethnic lines into mass violence. We'll see if the ceasefire holds. You had ongoing violence in Democratic Republic of Congo. You had Mali, which seems to be moving into a better place, but still, really extraordinary levels of violence very recently. So you have that conflict-based, really negative impact on human rights. You also, of course, have, which is really something that some of the others have talked about today, which is the intentional authoritarian repression of human rights. And one of the things that Freedom House and Human Rights Watch and many of the human rights groups, and certainly this is backed up in the State Department reports as well, document is a sort of sophistication in terms of how rights are repressed, and an increasingly sort of legalistic approach to repression of human rights. And so one of the interesting things in the Freedom House findings over the past few years is there are certain areas where thematically, rights seem to be doing a little better. The scores are better, and that's often in the sense of electoral processes and elections. However, they continue to see really stark, shocking declines in associational rights, freedom of assembly, freedom of speech, and rule of law and judicial independence. And one of the things that struck me, my good friend and former colleague, Arch Puddington, who is the overseer of the Freedom in the World survey, said, countries are no longer, authoritarians are no longer afraid of political opposition. They've done such a good job of making that playing field so uneven that there really isn't an actual competitive political opposition. But what they are afraid of course, is their own lack of legitimacy, and they're afraid of being called out by their citizens. They're afraid of freedom of the press. They're afraid of what that tells them about their own insecurities. And so you see these repressions on freedom of the press. You see all of this massive increase in these NGO laws, these laws that govern sort of the enabling environment for association and assembly. Russia started this trend, back in 2005 with a series of laws that made it very difficult, very burdensome requirements for organizations to register, hugely burdensome reporting requirements that were ridiculous. Very strong emphasis on negating foreign funding, right? And of course that's hugely insidious because the same governments make it almost impossible for civil society to get domestic funding. So, we all know the example of Khodorkovsky, who putting aside, whatever dirty things he might have done to become the millionaire that he became, he started getting interested in funding civil society. He started getting politically active, and that was immediately cut down. It sends a very strong message. So who's going to give money to a human rights NGO? In a country like Russia. And then at the same time, then if you cut off the ability of NGOs to take foreign funding and accuse them of serving the interests of foreign government, you've made it very, very effective policy at repressing voices that would contest your power, that would put a check on your power. Other organizations document this very well. Human Rights Watch also referred to it in its report. They called it abusive majoritarianism, right? So it's this decorative democracy. Having these institutions of democracy, but there's no there, right? They don't actually work. Arch Whittington said, central to the authoritarian strategy is the capture of institutions that undergird political pluralism, right? The goal is to dominate the media, the judiciary, civil society, and security forces, as well as the executive and legislature. They do this by this uneven playing field to create the aura of representing the will of the people, which doesn't exist. Authoritarians ensure favorable electoral outcomes through fraud and vote rigging, well before the election take place. So on the election day, things are peaceful. Generally, they go okay. But of course, in reality, there's no contestation of power in any way. I don't, however, share the pessimism, and again, one of the speakers alluded to this earlier about sort of the collapse of the human rights system and machinery. There are definitely problems, but I don't share that pessimism. I know shortly after Nelson Mandela's death, a noted human rights scholar wrote an article, an op-ed in the Washington Post called The End of Human Rights, and he declared that the ground of human rights is crumbling beneath us, citing all of these negative examples that had taken place, the brutal suppression, of course, of the Arab Spring, the inability of the international human rights community to deal with these issues. But I don't share this assessment, and there's reasons that I remain optimistic. One is that Freedom House and the State Department reports and this International Center for Not-for-Profit Law and Human Rights Watch and all of these groups all note one really, really positive trend, which is despite enormous pressure from governments, citizens, people continue to push back, and they actually have a fundamental sense of what their rights should be. It may be true that they don't know what the international human rights machinery is capable of. They may not know that those rights are tracked to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. They may not know what the articles of the ICCPR is, but they fundamentally recognize that they have a right to choose how they're governed, who their government should be. They have the right to fire their leaders. They have a right to say how their economy is run. They have a right to express themselves. They have a right to engage in peaceful assembly. And so despite this harassment, despite this increasingly sophisticated pushback that you see by governments, this idea of universality of human rights, I believe, has taken hold of the world's people, even if it hasn't necessarily been taken hold of by governments themselves. And ultimately, what the role of the international community is to identify these gaps and to provide as much space as possible for people within these countries to bring about change. So I am more optimistic. I also point out, as was pointed out earlier, that the overall trajectory has been remarkably positive. You know, back in 1972, when Freedom House first started its ratings, its quantitative analysis, and it's true, it only looks at political rights and civil liberties. That's a big job. I would love for somebody else to create a survey on economic, social, and cultural rights, but no one's done it yet, so we'll look at the political and civil rights. If you look back at their survey, 1975 was sort of the low point. At that point, only 25% of the world's states were rated as free. 41% of the world's states were not free. Over the next 25 years, there was absolutely unprecedented progress in moving towards freedom. Those numbers more than reversed. So by the year 2000, you had 45% of the world's states as free and only 21% of the world's states as not free. And so where did that expansion come? Obviously, we saw huge changes in Latin America, military dictatorships thrown out, the establishment of strong, strong democracies, more countries than not free, or at least partly free, although more free in that region of the world. And of course, you saw the massive changes in Central and Eastern Europe. You also saw, to a lesser extent, a real progress on the African continent as well. So again, while, as someone has already said, if you look in the short term, the trajectory has been negative. The long term has generally been a march towards more democracy, towards the protection and promotion of human rights. So maybe I'll stop there and you all can discuss.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you especially for raising the point that victims of human rights violations intuitively know that their rights are being violated. They may never read the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, but anybody who has suffered a grave human rights violation knows that they have suffered such a violation. Okay, now, as I said, we're going to have a very brief round of comments from the speakers, and I'm going to start with you, Ambassador. Would you mind giving a brief reaction to what's been said so far?
Thank you. Thank you once again. I'll save individual praise to the speakers for bilateral talks, but I was very impressed. 2 points. First, how do we measure human rights, protection, freedom, call it what you want? It still seems to me very, very difficult, and I think there's a danger in this discussion we've had of focusing only on the deliberate suppression of organized political dissent. That is extremely important and cannot be ignored in any way, but I just think a lot of human rights problems also within the civil and political rights sphere are related to other issues. And I think it's very difficult when you compare nations like China and Iraq, for instance, to say that China is not free and Iraq is a little less not free, as the Freedom House says. Because I think freedom is also about security. It's also about predictability in daily life. And I think the actual freedom of Chinese citizens, not to underline that example as more as others, has grown tremendously in the past 20 years. Some of it has nothing to do with human rights movement. A lot of it has to do with the technological development of the internet. But the access to information and the actual liberty and choice and so on is enormous. So I don't question the fundamental method of Freedom House, but I think there are some marginal issues where you can have a debate. Second, I think it's very promising and useful that we all seem to all agree that change starts at home, and it's crucial. It's not the international system itself that will bring about change. It can help it, but it depends on legitimate political forces at home. The question is then, what are our instruments at the international level? And here I would caution against the suggestion by David of more conditionality. Conditionality with foreign aid, conditionality with foreign trade is the next step. I don't think it works, and I think we would let down some of those growing oppositional forces if we were to apply that in a very consistent manner. Of course, there are examples where it has worked, and you mentioned many of them, but there are certainly also examples where it won't work. And I think exactly development aid is a field where we have to accept that engagement sometimes is better than isolation, even if there are fundamental problems. It's always a delicate balance, but in some situations we can actually bring about change, exactly as I said we were trying to do with a human rights-based approach, not just to civil rights and liberties, but also to more fundamental development issues such as education and health. Thank you.
Okay, Emily, do you want to go next?
Sure thing, thank you. I'll keep my comments very brief, and they're very similar to yours. I think it's really important as we have this conversation to always be returning to sort of the question of causality and the motives behind why people and institutions actually engage in human rights abuses, and deal with the fact that there are a lot of different reasons why these things happen, and that we need to be always linking our policy discussions about whether it be about military intervention or law or shaming or whatnot with actually the cause of what the problem is in the first place, because our abuse systems range from those things over which governments have institutional control to those over which they do not, and how we attempt to interface and the types of policies that we attempt to put to that effect must always return to that possibility. And it's complicated by the fact that when we look at our system, governments are participating in this system for very different reasons. We have a single institution, in a set of institutions in Geneva, where we have some governments who are doing it because they built the system and fundamentally believe in the values. We have others that are coerced into it and are joining the system because they want membership in the EU or various other things. We've got others who are trying to lock in policy. They're democratizing, so they're joining the system because they know they've got problems and they're hoping the system might help them. And you've got flat-out liars who are participating in the system and have absolutely no intention under any circumstances of abiding by the rules and laws. And this really complicates our job in terms of thinking about how we can design a single system when you have all of these different motives going on. So I can say more about that later. I think the other thing I want to just mention we haven't said yet is that the language of human rights is threatening. Right? Why do actors engage in human rights abuses, this causality discussion? Oftentimes because they perceive a threat that they want to put down. And we need to talk a little bit about the fact that human rights language can seem very threatening to governments. And we need to ask ourselves the question of what are the right circumstances to be engaging in the use of that language, which is at times seen as a threat, which at times propels more violence, versus changing our language to think about language that may be more amenable to actually changing situations on the ground that may seem a little less threatening. Because the bottom line is the only way we're going to change human rights behavior is by changing the interests of government. You've got to make governments think human rights in their interests. You have to make them see that it provides some value to them. And so I think that's interesting. The last point I'll say is that I actually don't think that victims always do know. I think if you're tortured and you know that you've been tortured, but the debate over female genital cutting, for example. This is an area where you have the quote-unquote victims themselves who have been making very powerful arguments for the practice. Now, my interpretation is that that is a violation, a fundamental violation of girls' rights and women's rights and so on and so forth. But the quote-unquote victims in this process, it's not so clear-cut. So I think that's, while I take your point, I think it's more nuanced than that. And I think that's important. Thank you.
Okay, Jacob, you're next.
Yeah. Well, it's having been relatively pessimistic, it's good to have Paula and others give tell me, yes, Jacob, you're still a young man, but you have to have the longer perspective, but I think, it's more comfortable for me being a pessimist. So I think there are some differences. I think there are some differences perhaps that when in the 80s when you were able to release dissidents from the Soviet Union was clearly on a downward trajectory when it comes to power. It doesn't seem to me that China, for instance, is on a downward trajectory when it comes to power. And China is clearly one of the spoiler states, and also one that is able to project values that are antithetical to human rights. I also think that when we saw that wave of new states becoming democracies, many of them were, of course, Eastern and Central European states, and they were, in a sense, low-hanging fruit, in the sense that some of them had a democratic history, and also because they were geographically close to the European Union, which had an opportunity to influence their governance, and it's not clear to me that the EU has the same opportunity to do that in other places of the world, where you don't have the same geographical proximity, where you don't have the same culture, shared culture, and so on. So I think those are factors that might point in the direction that we might see the next few years that Freedom House's reports will go on with this depressing development. I do, however, very much share some of the strategies that you mentioned, David. I think it is fundamentally important to speak up, but of course with the shifting in global powers, that does not become much easier. Denmark tried with China in the 90s to speak up for human rights. Didn't go down so well, and we haven't really tried again. And what we do now in Denmark is that if you demonstrate with a Tibetan flag while the Chinese premier is driving by, you get arrested, and so that tells you a bit about the change in global power that affects this area.
Well, I also agree with much of what I said. I would respectfully disagree with the ambassador about that role, but it's a great debate and there's many good points on all sides. One of the things that Scoop Jackson said was that America was blessed to have the world's greatest economy, and it could do more than enrich Americans. It could be pressed into service as a commitment to the country's individual liberty. And that's kind of the way I see it. And I think there are many opportunities, certainly many stories I have of dissidents who say, we're totally disheartened, we're totally undercut by the relationships Western states have with our own governments funding, supporting Armenian, because we know where their loyalties lie. We know that they're not serious, and that's at least been the one that I've been exposed to. But it's a good debate. I'm a little bit more with William Easterly and Jeffrey Sachs on the issue of aid and what happens. But in any case, I'd just like to make one or two quick points, which when you said why are human rights abuses committed, one thing that wasn't mentioned, at least perhaps enough in depth, was religion and culture. And to the gentleman's question about the Soviet Union, another great difference is that certainly in the Middle East there are often huge liberal majorities that think, at least according to the Pew studies, etc., if you change your religion, you must be killed. When they did this study in Egypt, they said 84% of Egyptians said that anyone who changes their religion should be killed. I asked a liberal Egyptian blogger friend of mine about this number, and she said that's definitely not true. It's 99%. In Jordan, 86%, I believe, was the number. In ostensibly liberal, so-called liberal, Gulf sheikhdoms like Kuwait, every single member of the Kuwaiti parliament, except for 4, voted to give the death penalty to anyone who criticizes religion, or Islam, or Muhammad, or the Quran, or his wives, or the companions of the Prophet. And the 4 who voted against it did so because it did not also include the death penalty for insulting Shiite imams. And so how does one advance human rights? What mechanism can convince someone who believes that it's a religious dictate to slaughter someone who changes their religion? I don't have the answer to that, but that's a pressing human rights issue, and it's one that I don't think is spoken honestly enough about, including with so-called allies who are very proud of this rule. I had one confrontation with Saudi Arabia's ambassador to the UN
Abdullah al-Malami, and when a colleague of mine asked him, what about Hamza Kashgari, a young Saudi blogger who had been in prison for, was released after 2 years for writing 3 tweets questioning religion, I expected him to say something along the lines of, well, this has been a great misunderstanding. Of course, we don't think that people should be in prison for this. And he said very stridently in front of hundreds of students at NYU, he said, this must never be allowed in my country to criticize or question God, ever. It's a pretty strident statement. And this is, I think, true in many states throughout the region. I had a discussion one time with a Kuwaiti diplomat and someone in the Prime Minister's office, and he runs up to me and says, I know you run a human rights organization. I want you to know that in Kuwait, we completely respect freedom of expression and free speech. You can walk up to the leadership and insult them to their face, and you'll be completely fine. And I said, well, what about Muhammad Abdul Qadir Jassim, famous blogger, editor of Newsweek Arabic, who was imprisoned for insulting the emir? And he says, well, of course he has to go to prison for that. I said, but you just told me. He said, no, but that crosses the red line. You see, in my country, according to the Constitution, the emir is inviolable, and so that's just illegal, and we believe in the rule of law. I mean, so one of the really pressing human rights issues, at least in the Middle East, that I don't think gets its proper share is how do you take a majority of people in certain countries who believe such fanatic things that are in direct contravention of freedom of expression, freedom of religion, freedom of faith, and change that? I don't know the answer to that, but that's something that I'd love to come back to Copenhagen and discuss that.
Okay, we should have a few minutes at least of discussion. Maybe, Jacob, you could advise me how many minutes, because it's 12 o'clock now.
Yeah, let's take 5 questions, and then we'll see if that is satisfactory.
Okay. Okay, we have 5 questions. Who wants to ask the first one? Since you already asked a question, I'm going to go to somebody else first. And there's a gentleman in the back. Okay, you. That's right. You wanted to speak before? Could you identify yourself, please?
I'm a visiting fellow at the University of Copenhagen. Just a quick question to canvass the views of the panel on, there's been a lot of discussion about problems with enforcement of human rights, particularly at the international level, pessimism regarding human rights protections around the world. So what about the elephant in the room, and that is military intervention as a way of vindicating human rights violations? I'd like to canvass the panel's view on that. Thank you.
No, I think we shouldn't. I think we should ask anybody on the panel, would they like to respond to that question? Would anybody like to respond to the question?
Danish Armed Forces to respond. Well, thanks. I can state our policy. The Danish government's policy is that we have a responsibility to protect, and it's first and foremost the Security Council which has a responsibility and an obligation to act in the face of threatening crimes against humanity and so on. But I don't think there's a clear-cut answer to the question of what extent can military intervention be used to promote or secure human rights. We are one of the countries who accept that in very exceptional circumstances it could be legitimate and in accordance with international law to act with the use of force despite the absence of a mandate from the United Nations Security Council. It's a very long discussion, but I just want to make the point that responsibility to protect is not something primarily about acting outside the mandate of the UN Security Council. It's sometimes misunderstood or sometimes misportrayed as that concept, but it's a lot more than that.
Okay, thank you. Let's ask the next question. Okay, I'm going to take you now because you're so persistent. Keep it quickly, though.
Yes. question for the Danish ambassador. You questioned the notion of conditionality when it comes to human rights. And if you accept that premise, I think it would imply that you have to be very vocal and very critical, but at the same time you seem to be quite timid or hesitant when it comes to criticizing oppressive regimes within the Human Rights Council in Geneva. So isn't that a kind of hypocrisy? If you really want to follow your line with conditionality, I think it would imply that you have to be very critical, and in fact it is what Denmark did during the Helsinki process, when we were very vocal on the third basket, and at the same time insisting on dialogue and not boycotting and having sanctions and things like that.
Quickly, I think we are very critical in the United Nations Human Rights Council. I think you can't measure it just by looking at the number of recommendations we give. We stand up and give recommendations, harsh and blunt recommendations to countries such as China and Saudi Arabia, hardly countries which you would say are convenient or easy to criticize in the international relations as a very small nation. And I think we are using the voice we have to voice criticism, but there are also other tools than just criticizing or introducing sanctions. There are tools in between which we should also use and not ignore.
Okay, we have two down and three to go. Who's next? Okay, I see a gentleman on this side. Your hand is quite tall. On the left, on my left. Okay, please identify yourself.
Ahmed Said, University of Copenhagen. And my question is to David. In your quick survey of the Middle East, you mentioned countries like Egypt under Mubarak, Syria, Saudi Arabia, and other countries. But you didn't mention or discuss the recent developments in Egypt, or perhaps the political promotion of the Jewish character of Israel, for instance. So my question is, was this a conscious selection, or it was only due to speech time limits? Thank you.
Sure. Well, I'm certainly very interested in both countries. On a professional level and organizationally, we only deal with dictatorships, not because democracies and more open societies don't have problems. They do, and they must be addressed. And in countries like Israel and America that have many, many human rights issues, there's robust civil society and thousands of organizations working to advance, thousands of people in human rights organizations, suing the government, criticizing the government in a free press, etc. And so it's out of no lack of awareness of problems in open societies. But I believe that we must bring dictatorships up to the level of democracies, and that's how I see my role. But that said, Egypt is a really fascinating case now because people essentially, they see it as a binary choice. Either we support the return to military dictatorship under Sisi, or we support the Muslim Brotherhood, and depending on how you see things, you go one way or the other. I think both are autocratic in nature, and both need to be undermined. That there's a third way, and that is support for true moderates and true liberals and true Democrats. And for as weak as they may be today, the Western world can do a lot more to support their cause. And turning a blind eye is, young bloggers, Ahmed thrown in prison is a horrible, horrible thing to do. And at the same time, we must recognize that organizations like the Muslim Brotherhood, which are theocratic in nature but not democratic in nature, do not hold a positive future for Egypt. Just to give you one example, when Khairat al-Shatir gave a seminal speech, senior Muslim Brotherhood official, about what the Muslim Brotherhood would do in power, he said very plainly, we will impose religion on every facet of human existence. So that should also be terrifying, but it's not an excuse to support a military dictatorship in Egypt today.
Okay, I'd like to call on the young man whose hand is up. That's right.
Thank you very much.
Thomas for calling me a young man. My name is Christian Friesbach. I'm a member of Parliament, and I'm sorry I came in late, but there are a few things happening in Parliament today, as some of you may have noticed. But thank you for a fascinating discussion. And my question is to Paula, actually, because I listened carefully to your point, strengthening civil society. I couldn't agree more. But if there's one thing I believe we have learned from the past 10 years, Afghanistan, Somalia, Sudan, Mali, is that state building is even more important. Building the institutions that can protect human rights and building the institutions that create a social contract to the people and thereby strengthen the democracy and framework in which civil society can function. And here we are not, I believe, in any government in the world, willing enough. And it goes perhaps especially for the US. You have a lot of constraints in Congress and government giving budget support to Somalia or other governments. So what's your view on this? How can we strengthen, in line with the New Deal principles, which I perhaps think you know, state building in an approach to protecting human rights, even with states in which that we do not agree with? Thank you.
Look, I completely agree. I mean, I think state building is a huge part of it. And I think even within the most closed societies, there are people that you can work with and that you can train and you can try to empower. But in very authoritarian settings, there often aren't very many openings for those people to really play a genuine role, and so it can be very tricky. I think that there has been some real success in states where there is a genuine political will to move towards democracy and to respect human rights, and where capacity building really is the issue for them. And I think the point was made in Central and Eastern Europe, in a sense they were low-hanging fruit. Everybody knew what they wanted, right? They wanted some kind of democratic system, some level of free market economy, exactly what kind of system, whether it was going to be presidential or parliamentary, et cetera, all of that was in question. But there was this will, there was a genuine interest in creating functioning democratic institutions, and it made it very easy. The challenge has been in societies where it really is sort of lip service, right? Everybody has to at least pretend these days, and that's not a bad thing. Everybody has to pretend that they are somewhat democratic, right? So the most repressive countries in the world actually put democratic in the name of their country. And even though, of course, a lot of these states push the economic, social, and cultural rights at the international human rights mechanisms, they, to some degree or another, do have to pretend that they are governing with the consent of their people, but they're not genuinely interested, they're not genuinely willing to open those institutions to function as they really should. And that's really been the much, much trickier part, and I think it's one of the reasons why it's going to be really, really hard in the Middle East. There's not the attraction of the EU. There's not the process through which they have to make certain reforms because everybody wants the same thing. And you have so many people who really don't have the political will to develop these institutions. It doesn't mean that it's not possible. And we're all talking about the negative stories in Egypt, but let's not forget, let's not forget Tunisia. I mean, I don't want to put too much on it, but what an incredible opportunity is there. It's clearly not done. It's clearly not a consolidated democracy. It could go the wrong way, but it shows you the difference it makes when there is a political will to care about the future of the country and put that above, say, the mandate of your party or of your religious group, et cetera. And so I think it can be done. That's a setting where you can go in and you can start building some of those democratic institutions. I think it's important, but it can be very hard, and political will is a key factor.
Okay, I think we have one more question. The gentleman who had his hand up before, could you please identify yourself?
Thank you. My name is Ruben Dieckhoff, and I'm with Friedrich Naumann Foundation from Germany. And my question goes to Mr. Liesberg, because you said that sometimes engagement is better than isolation, and I would call this somehow to be the eternal struggle of diplomacy and foreign policy. And currently in Germany we have a big debate about how to treat Russia, and my government doesn't seem to have an idea and seems to be divided on how to treat Putin in those days. And I would be interested if the Danish government has some guidelines or indicators on in which cases you start to engage and in which cases you say, well, isolation is better, or doesn't it in the end come down to geostrategy?
It's a very fundamental question, and I should be careful not to stray away from my brief, which is human rights, not our relations with Russia. But of course, they are interlinked, and I agree that there is an internal struggle and balancing to be managed between isolation at the extreme end and complete engagement and embrace on the other end. And I don't think I have any advice to offer our German colleagues, but it is a question that I know the new German government is pondering, and we're all in the EU trying to find the right answer to just how much criticism, just how much engagement will actually improve the situation in Russia and improve also the human rights situation.
I think that we should close this section at this point, and I'd like to thank the speakers for their very interesting presentations, and thank all of the members of the audience for your patience and your engagement in our meeting and our discussion.